Welcome back to teleSUR English. We go live to Russia once again as world leaders continue to arrive in Moscow ahead of May 9th celebrations of Victory Day. In this case, we are witnessing the arrival of Chinese President Xi Jinping. He is arriving at the Russian capital, as have other leaders worldwide. Xi Jinping's visit to Russia in this occasion is one of the highlights of this week, as the bilateral between the Chinese president and Russian president may be among the key encounters regarding these days prior to Victory Day celebrations. Let's recall that these world leaders are arriving in Russia to take part in the 80th anniversary of the victory of Soviet Union forces against fascism in 1945. So we are looking at images of the plane that brings Chinese President Xi Jinping to Russia ahead of Victory Day celebrations. China-Russia relations are among key strategic relations in this global world context, in their proposal of a multipolar world that pretends to overcome the unilateral world order, unipolar world order pretended by US imperialism, and this cooperation between the Asian and Eurasian nations has been key in this regard and is set to mark the years to come. In this context, we see the arrival, and that gives the relevance of the presence of Chinese President Xi Jinping at this event. Let's recall that in Russia, Victory Day, and in this case the 80th anniversary of Victory Day, that is the victory of Soviet Union against fascism, is among the most important holidays of the country. It's the day in which the nation remembers and celebrates their key participation at the world stage in maybe the most significant battle that marked the 20th century, and in particular the role that the Soviet Union played at that time, a role that Western narrative over the Second World War, that is also sustained by Western leaders today, for example Donald Trump, have tried time and time again to eradicate from their history books the participation and the decisive actions of the Soviet army in their victory against fascism. So the commemoration of this event is key for a country such as Russia, and the worldwide recognition of the event with the presence of key global leaders as Chinese President Xi Jinping that we see is arriving at this moment to Russia speaks of the world relevance today of that commemoration. 80 years have passed since 1945, and in this context in which much of the international alliance, a lot of organizations and also strategic bonds between countries are talking of a new international fight against fascism, specifically from the global south, among and in the framework of a global context that is directly attacking the principles of multipolarity and directly attacking through different ways both countries in the global south and also other key actors in the world scene that pretend to impose, that pretend to overcome the unilateral and unipolar power that, for example, United States imperialism pretends to be. We have seen, for example, in the latest announcements made by US President Donald Trump regarding the trade war that he has unleashed on the world, how China has been one of their main targets. However, we have also seen how in the past days, US diplomats have had to come back on some of their initial positions and are talking about holding negotiations as their Chinese counterparts continue to make it clear that they will negotiate on their own term and they are the ones defending international trade order. They are the ones defending the rules of international law. So in this context, we need to understand the relevance of the events that are taking place in Russia with, in this case, we see the airplane that is bringing Xi Jinping, President of China, to take part in the 80th anniversary of Victory Day celebrations that will take place on May 9th. And we've also seen other leaders from around the world, heads of state, for example, Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel, who also held a bilateral meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Also, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, who as well held a bilateral meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin and also signed a series of cooperation agreements. A key moment for relations between Venezuela and Russia to be stepping up and strengthening their ties at this global context. So we see that the arrival of these key leaders to this celebration is not only a matter of commemorating a historical event that marked the turn of the 20th century and also continues to shape the world as it is today, but also a moment of strengthening ties among different countries and nations in the world whose leaders continue to speak in favor of multipolarity, continue to speak in favor of South-South cooperation, continue to foster relations that are based on mutual respect, but that are allowing those nations to develop strategic areas of their national economies in a model that foster cooperation rather than competition. So we have strategic agreements on terms regarding energy, development in terms of infrastructure, development in terms of technology, the sharing of information regarding key areas of progress that experts say will mark the years to come, as is, for example, artificial intelligence, also everything concerning climate change and the way it is affecting primarily the countries in the global south, even though it's the nations in the north that have caused the biggest environmental impacts. All of these topics are brought to the table at a moment in which world leaders that are speaking in favor of multipolarity are meeting in Russia this week in this framework that has to do with the celebration of the 80th anniversary of Victory Day. We reiterate that we're looking at images of the arrival of Chinese President Xi Jinping to Moscow 2 days ahead of May 9th celebration of the 80th anniversary of the win that the Soviet army had in front of Nazism, in front of fascism in the year 1945. Those are the images. We were speaking to the relevance of this visit in particular that brings Chinese leader to the Russian Federation. We'll possibly expect in the coming hours different topics and possible agreements to be brought up. Let's recall that these leaders are among the most important in the world and the most sensitive topics to understand. Some of the most sensitive issues affecting the world today are being discussed by the leaders of Russia, China, key countries in Latin America, key countries in Africa. We've seen delegations from the Republic of the Congo, also delegations from Burkina Faso, with a very significant and popular-based process being carried out in the African country, and also deepening ties with the Russian Federation in that process against colonialism, against European colonialism. Another point to highlight in this context is that if Europe and the United States meant to isolate Russia over the past years with a series of unilateral measures or sanctions that meant to cut ties or hinder ties between Russia and the rest of the world, what we are seeing today is a demonstration that Russia is definitely not isolated and right now very much the center of what is happening in terms of the possibility of building a multipolar world or a pluripolar world. We are saying this as we are looking at the images of the plane. The stairs have been laid and we'll probably just in a few moments have images of Chinese President Xi Jinping walking down those stairs and being greeted at this Moscow airport, as other significant world leaders have also been greeted at this place. We've seen the arrival of the president of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, just hours ago. Also, delegation from the Republic of the Congo. Also representatives from Latin America, such as Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel. We've also seen significant world leaders, not head of state at the moment, but former presidents such as Dilma Rousseff, former president of Brazil, and currently head of the BRICS Development Bank, another key institution of this part of the world. And we're talking about the BRICS, and with the arrival of Chinese President Xi Jinping, we have two of its main leaders here in Russian soil at the moment, Russia and China being among the main actors in this bloc that has, since its existence, tried to foster a multipolar exchange, the possibility of a world that respects global trade, that respects sovereignty of each nation and that looks to the possibility of developing without hindering the development of different nations, particularly in the global south. Brazilian President Lula da Silva, another key actor in this bloc, is also expected to arrive in Russia this week ahead of Victory Day celebrations. So definitely there will be conversations regarding the key challenges and positions that the BRICS group needs to deal with and also take in the face of new challenges. And by new challenges, for example, the measures that have been taken by new US President Donald Trump regarding the trade war that has targeted countries all over the world and pretends to hinder international trade, affecting, of course, the commerce and the development possibilities of nations from across the continents. The BRICS group has maintained a position of demanding respect to international law in terms of commerce, and these will be possibly topics to continue following. We see now that the doors have opened for the plane that's arriving from China. Let's recall that we are awaiting for Chinese President Xi Jinping to officially mark his arrival to Russian soil. And there we see that he is waving from the plane, one of the key leaders at this moment in the world stage, Chinese President Xi Jinping, arriving in Moscow ahead of the Victory Day, the celebrations of the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Soviet Union against fascism, against Nazism. Maybe one of the most relevant leaders at stage at this moment. As we were saying, dealing, for example, with the trade war that the US has pretended to begin with new President Donald Trump, who has had very aggressive and severe statements, then backing down on some statements, but initiating or pretending to initiate a trade war while Chinese diplomats maintain that they are willing to negotiate under circumstances in which their sovereignty is respected. They continue to demand respect for international law and for trade law. And in that context, very sensitive context, we see the arrival of Chinese President Xi Jinping to Russian soil. Let's listen to the music. We are looking at images from Russia as an official delegation is welcoming Chinese President Xi Jinping. He is among the world leaders that is arriving in Russia ahead of Victory Day celebrations. from President Xi Jinping, already in Russian soil, as many other world leaders have been arriving ahead of the 80th anniversary of Victory Day. Again, one more instance in which we see the relevance of this week and what is happening in Russia at the moment. Let's recall that the parade to honor and celebrate that 80th anniversary of the victory against fascism in 1945 will take place on May 9th, and we've been seeing leaders from all over the world, all over the continent, arrive to join Russia and the Russian people in these celebrations. So those were live images as Chinese President Xi Jinping arrived in Moscow to take part in the celebrations, as have other world leaders, of this 80th anniversary of Victory Day to be celebrated on May 9th. We'll continue bringing you all the information. Stay tuned in teleSUR English.
Interest in my